introduce Darrick McGhee, who's the Chief Operations Officer and Lobbyist for Johnson & Blanton. Darrick, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all are doing absolutely well. Happy Monday to you all. It's an honor to be on and kind of provide you a presentation. So last week, Tuesday, the governor released his recommended budget. And just for purpose of education, the governor is instructed and required to release his recommended budget at least 30 days before the beginning of the legislative session that's forthcoming. And so he released it last Tuesday. And I'm going to share with you just some high levels of the items that's in that recommended budget. It's important to also point out that this is his recommended budget. The best way to really view and appreciate it is the governor is saying, if I were allowed to actually pass our state's budget, this is how I would do it. Now, we know that this responsibility is actually on the House and the Senate. The legislative branch does this. And so they receive the governor recommended budget. They look at what he is proposing for funding. They take it into consideration. Sometimes they will take it wholly. Sometimes they will make changes to it. But it is a document that is received, and then they work on the state budget. The House and Senate is responsible for actually passing a balanced budget. It's also important to point out that the one main responsibility of our legislative branch is to pass a balanced budget that goes into effect July 1. Everything else we do during session, albeit important, is really the icing on the cake. A balanced budget has to be handled by the House and Senate and passed in their chambers and get to the governor every time we convene. And so in front of you is a screen for a few high-level items in the governor recommended budget that was released last week. He's proposing $27.8 million for FEFP. And so you see this is about a $107 increase on base student allocations, right? The governor is continuing his advocacy and push for providing funding for teacher salaries and instructional personnel. So this is something that he has consistently been appropriating funds for. It's also about $8,842 in FEFP, which is about a $175 increase from current fiscal year. And so we're seeing some increases of what the governor is proposing. Allow me to also share that unlike the previous recommended budget from last year, the governor's recommended budget this go around actually is, the numbers are more conservative than they were before. The governor is really being very, very strategic as to how he is recommending monies be appropriated. Next slide, please. Here is more high-level items. And so these items are very, very important. Again, very specific to education. Looking at about $450 million for Florida's VPK program, which is a very important program. For the TEACH program, the governor is proposing $10 million. This is important because it's providing early childhood teacher scholarships, and then about $3 million for statewide professional development. As you know, Florida has become even more attentive in providing advocacy as it relates to early childhood education. Even our soon-to-be speaker is going to speak a little about this and her background in this area and her advocacy in this regard. But this is something that's very, very important and very encouraging. Computer science is also something that we have seen become more and more important in our state over the last few years. The governor is proposing $10 million in this area for certifying teachers in computer science, which is very important. $4 million for the teacher apprenticeship program and mentor bonus, and then about $3.5 million for the dual enrollment teacher scholarship program. Again, these numbers here are important to be referenced as the governor's recommending these dollar amounts for these programs. This may or may not be the final numbers once the House and Senate convene. Session convenes Tuesday, January the 9th, and it goes into the adjournment of Friday, March the 9th. So a lot of work is yet to be done in this regard. And so we are encouraged by what's being proposed and still knowing there's still work that's before us in that regard. Mary made mention of our dollar amount for consortium. There's work to be done in that regard as well. So we are encouraged going into session. We are grateful for what we're hearing, what we're seeing, and we are expecting even more work to be done toward all things K-12 in that regard. I want to take this time now, if I may, to introduce our guest speaker. It is Senator Alexis Calatayud. She is from Miami-Dade, Florida. She represents District 38. She is the youngest senator in the Florida Senate. She is a huge K-12 proponent as well as early learning. I've had a chance of knowing her for several years. She's the former aide of former Representative Vanessa Lupus. She also worked inside our Florida Department of Education, and she is in her freshman term of the Florida Senate. But I'm very grateful to have her be a part of our conversation today. Senator, are you there?
Darrick, I don't believe that she's been successful connecting quite yet. So
Yes.
I think I'm going to hand it back to you to start talking about some of the legislative priorities and bills that have been introduced.
Okay, I can do that. And Bill, she's saying she's in the attendee portal.
We'll get her in.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And so I want to, if you allow me, I'll speak to a few bills that are have already been filed, and then when the senator comes on, we will bring her on. A couple of bills that have been filed thus far that we think is important to lay out is Senate Bill 460. This bill has been filed by Senator Corey Simon. It is a career and technical education bill. Senator Simon actually campaigned as this being a priority of his, dealing with career and technical education. And so this bill will allow student learners between the ages of 16 and 17 to work if they already have their OSHA certification, they can actually begin working under direct supervision. And this is something that's very important. As Senator Simon, he has used his own son, Corey Simon Jr., as an example of someone who was not ready to go to college. He just wasn't excited about going to college right away. He wanted to go into a trade. And so his son is finishing up in welding. And Senator Simon has been making it known that he really wants to provide more conversation and consideration for the trade. We also have Senate Bill 470 and House Bill 465, which is post-secondary education students. This bill is by Senator Ngolia and Representative Temple. This bill basically says that students on an F1 visa will support terrorist organizations will be assessed out-of-state fees. This has been going on as a result of what we see with Israel and Hamas. So there are some bills in this lane that we want to pay attention to.
Darrick?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Darrick, the senator is available now.
There we go. So ladies and gentlemen, if you again allow me to introduce Senator Alexis Calla to you, that she's on as our special guest. Senator, good afternoon to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you all see me, hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can see and hear you. It's on you.
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you for the wonderful introduction and for being an incredible primer for the advocates on this call to be engaged this legislative session. We have a rip-roaring exciting time for education, folks. One of the Senate priorities this legislative session is learn local. And as Darrick was mentioning, Senator Simon is starting us off with a massive education deregulation package in the areas of assessments. I'm personally working on the deregulation package of education related to instructional personnel, teachers, and we also have our colleague, Senator Hudson, who's working on finances and operations in our deregulation world. I wanted to mention that we're really excited about philosophically and in all real terms, equaling the playing field for our publics with the new ecosystem that we have launched in Florida after HB1. And our true belief is to be a partner with the highest quality outcomes and make sure that all of the education providers have the ability to be flexible, to be creative in a way that in no way jeopardizes our focuses, always number one, student safety and student performance outcomes. So that's what is at the core of Senate public education deregulation. I'm also personally working on some early childhood education policy with my incredible colleague, Senator Grahl, and wonderful partners in the House, Representative Trabolsi and Representative McFarland. We're partnering together on what's going to be a trifecta of bills on a tax credit for early learning, for a bundle of policy related to licensures, of early childhood education. And the last piece of policy, which will be focused around school readiness, eligibility increase, which will likely be modest. Also, the increasing of reimbursement rates, which have been frozen for several years. And we're also working to create a more sustainable path out of receiving school readiness subsidies from the entrance to the exit, in which families can truly be supported on their path to economic mobility and to self-sufficiency. Very similar to the thought process and the model we utilized last legislative session on passing Florida Kid Care eligibility expansion, in which as a household income increases, so does the expected household contribution for the cost of that service. Last year, we were talking about subsidized children's health insurance. This year, we're talking about childcare, early learning. So those are two really important, exciting pieces of policy that are happening, our universe of deregulation and early childhood education. Those are the three bills, I guess, in each of those silos that I think are ones to watch. I saw the poll right before we started, but maybe I should stop right there and send it back to you, Darrick.
Senator, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on. I know Bill's going to get back on because there's going to be some questions we're going to take. I wanted you to speak to, if you could, just from your years of doing education. I mentioned in the introduction about just the advocacy work you've done for a long time with childhood education, but also what you've been doing in K-12, right? And where we've been over the last few years, and what's led to the deregulation bill. Can you speak to that?
Great question. Yes, sir, absolutely. So the vision behind deregulation is that we have worked not just the last couple years, but we have worked over the last about 25 years on creating an environment of educational choice in Florida, particularly in the K-12 system, that is, I mean, bar none. We are the most prolific, creative, dynamic choice environment for parents to be able to provide their child the exact education that they will most benefit from in the nation. So we've been working diligently since the early 2000s on step-by-step creating that choice opportunity. The Senate truly believes that we have reached an incredible apex of those efforts last legislative session when we passed House Bill 1 and we created universal education savings accounts and the universal voucher program, where essentially any family would be able to utilize a true choice environment. With this place, we also want to make sure that our 4-inch thick education rules and laws book, that so many of those uniquely and only apply to our public and charter education programs, we want to make sure that we haven't created an over-regulated market in which our public education system is become unwieldy because of anything Tallahassee may have done. At the core of that belief, though, is that student outcomes, learning gains, are our #1 priority as the state to set, and to make sure that across the state, all 67 districts, all 74 LEAs are rising to the occasion of giving every child truly the most transformative education possible to give them the best life that their family could imagine for them. We want to make sure that we haven't been adding over the years cumbersome regulation that makes, in this incredibly competitive education market, a way that public schools can't compete. So we want to make sure we're removing burdens to competitiveness to provide the best high quality I'm into the child care thing, the greatest high quality, the greatest high efficacy education experience for our K-12 students as possible. As we're becoming more competitive, as we have greater numbers of education providers in the market, we want to make sure that our public education system, which still educates the vast majority of students across the state of Florida, is as nimble as possible.
Senator, a question that was sent to me thinking about is, when you think about deregulation, can you speak to, does deregulation equate to less accountability? I know the answer, but it's for the viewing audience. What would you say to that?
Yeah. So just to go back to our core values, student outcomes, student performance, student learning gains, and student safety. These are our North Star, that a child is safe and that a child is learning and building their future. And if you ask me, education is about not just learning, but it's about economic upward mobility for that child, for that family. So immutably, when we started the exercise in the summer of analyzing every single law in the Florida education statute books, that was our primer. We will not in any way touch an item that reduces the impactfulness of our education programs or the safety of our children. Everything else, though, is for consideration if it is a cumbersome regulation. And as conservatives, that's a core value. We talk a lot about deregulation in our business environment. It was important at this point, as we consider the competitive market of education providing, that we also looked at the laws that we're only applying with our public education system.
Well, Senator, you were the aide, a really good member and a really good guy. You worked in DOE and now a member. So tell the audience if there's anything that has surprised you as being a member versus the other roles, what has that been? Or has there been anything, right?
I think you get listened to a little bit more.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, what many may not know, I mean, you've done a lot already, right? You've already done one session, had a huge affordable housing, workforce housing bill last year, doing deregulation this year, and a lot of other things that are very, very important. As I mentioned in the intro, you have been a great champion for early education, a great champion for just K-12. You know, one of the things I know that's probably gonna come up one of the questions is dealing with teacher shortage. That's something that's been going on. You've been an advocate, again, all things education. Anything you want to share on that? And we're going to let Bill come back in for any questions that's coming through the portal. Anything you want to share on this teacher shortage or just anything in that regard?
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So at the Department of Education, while I was Director of Policy, I was responsible for submitting to the legislature the critical teacher shortage report for the last 2 years. And so I was intimately familiar with those numbers. Last year I ran our teacher recruitment and retention package that created the teacher mentorship program that acts as an apprenticeship, gives a 2-year tuition waiver, along with a plethora of other resources and incentives for people to stay or enter the education profession. We need to look under, every rock for additional ways to support our teachers, leave nothing on the table. In the legislation I'm carrying now for education deregulation, we're completely focused on giving teachers, principals, school district administrators, school boards, the tools to attract and retain great talent. That's all throughout our policy. So I think on that issue, incredibly passionate about it, something I ran on, having a background in education, but also knowing how much work still needed to be done for teacher recruitment and retention. And I do apologize. I need to jump off the call, but I'm so grateful for the time you've allowed me to share with the group.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Senator. I think I missed her before she left. So Darrick, we had some questions coming through, and some cases I'm going to ask you to channel the senator. I know you're having conversations with all those folks, so I think you have a pretty good idea of the mindset. But during your conversation with the senator about deregulation, there were a number of questions about what that means. And I think I know the answer to this, like you said before, but still, have there been any concrete examples, or what will be the process of deregulation from legislation through implementation?
It's a really, really good question. And so I think it's important to make mention. So the Senate has released 3 bills. As she mentioned, she's sponsoring one. Senator Simon has one, and Senator Hudson has the other. 3 different versions of the bill. The House has yet to roll out companion bills, and there's been conversations had, right, about where things will end up being. We don't know when the House will actually roll out their companion version of the bill. And so the first order of business, of course, is they have to pass their respective chambers favorably. The Senate bills are actually up this week in Senate Fiscal Policy, which is the last stop in the Senate. So our first week of session, the week of January 9th, the Senate bills will be primed and ready to be voted on, at least heard on the full Senate floor. Again, really not knowing yet what the House will do or not do in relates to this. As we know, any bill until it gets to the governor still will go through several iterations of changes and conversation. But let's fast forward. Everything gets through, it passes majority vote in both chambers, goes to the governor signs it into law. First thing to think about is what's the effective date on the bill, right? So if it says July 1, which most bills would do, right, beginning of our fiscal year, what then happens then is, depending upon what they're addressing in deregulation, we can anticipate upon the governor receiving the bill, acting upon the bill, the Department of Education will be in conversation with your Florida Association of District School Superintendents, with the potentially with the Florida Education Association, working with your schools and with teachers, trying to make sure that they're educated on what's in the bill, but also working toward a seamless transition and implementation that needs to be done in that regard. I think things will span out for a while, right? We should not, as much as they may want to have everything done immediately, I do think that it's important to point out that some of these things may take time, and I mean time, not in years, but we may not see everything happen at the same exact time. Maybe a tiered system they put in place. But the anticipated goal is that all the deregulation ideals, for the most part, will be addressed or handled during the upcoming fiscal year of 24-25, so July 1 in that regard.
And if I'm not mistaken, the 3 Senate bills are 7,000, 7,002, and 7,004.
That's correct.
Yeah. So anybody watching who wants to read any of the details, go to the website for the Senate, and you can track those there. So what I'm hearing is that it is not that the legislators in a vacuum are going to be determining what may need to be changed, but they're through outreach, getting input from a variety of different sources.
Yep. Yeah. So I will share with the audience that the Senate president made a commitment that she wanted to hear from as many parties as possible, and so she and her team have met with and heard from, again, the Florida Association of District School Superintendents. The president and CEO of that organization is former Senator Bill Munford. So they brought forth some recommendations. I think other organizations have as well. And there's still groups that still need to be brought to the table in that regard. But this is not happening behind closed doors, just among senators. They really are trying to entertain conversations and recommendations. As you can anticipate with any legislation, right, there's going to be parties that may not be fully in support. You need to have those conversations as well. The governor's office, the executive branch, is just as important to that conversation. Everything, none of the bills are public, is being handled in the sunshine. And so any and all persons who are interested are permitted to come to committee and actually speak for, against, or even ask questions about the legislation. Again, until we see what the House is going to do or not do, and we don't know the direction yet of how fast this will actually advance during session. Right now, things are happening fast in the Senate, but they'll slow down once session begins until the House actually takes action.
Right, and there was a question here about the difference between the Senate and House versions, but I think I heard House has not put forward versions of those bills yet.
The House does not have any companion bills yet to those 3. So 7,000, 7,002, 7,004 are all Senate bills with no House companions just yet.
Good, thank you. Let's see. What do you see happening to improve the critical shortage of student services personnel, for example, school counselors?
Well, that's a good question. My short answer is I'm not sure. A little longer answer is I'm not sure, because there's a lot of conversations being had on several things, including absenteeism. Again, we talked earlier about teacher pay and addressing that matter, just teacher retention in general. And so I would And a longer answer say, I think everything's on the table for conversation, and that's a truthful answer. But as far as that in itself, there really hasn't been any definitive discussions about that. But I think there's a long road to the finish line. And so we would definitely, from the lobbying team standpoint, keep everybody abreast as we hear more.
Yeah, and I would recommend to the gentleman who submitted that question that if that's an issue, make sure your legislator knows that's an issue too, because some of these things haven't risen to the same level of other issues. But let me follow up. You talked about absenteeism. I saw that last week the House Quality Subcommittee had a hearing on chronic absenteeism. I know it's a concern. We all know that it's impacting learning. Has there been any conversation about, or is there anything legislatively that could be done to address it?
That's a great question, Bill. And so, yes, last week there was a full discussion had in the House regarding absenteeism. They gave statistics, which is very alarming, right? Just seeing what it looks like. And I would submit that there was already a level of absenteeism happening prior to COVID. It really intensified during COVID, an alarming rate. I mean, there's some areas of our state, some of our districts that have a high percentile of absenteeism in that regard. At the end of that discussion, other than addressing the concerns and having open conversation, there really wasn't a real plan that was rolled out as to what they're going to do or how they're going to address this. Because it involves so many parties, right? It involves not only the schools, but also parents and families. How do you get in contact with families and things of that nature? And so I think that discussion's in flux. I wish I had a better answer to give, but even after the presentation last week, there really wasn't a definitive solution to the problem that's been identified. I do say this in my closing, we should expect more conversation during session on absenteeism, because not only is there a concern about children not being educated, there's also a fiscal impact, right? Because you're looking at schools get funding based on kids in classes and based on seats. And so how do you determine that in that regard? And how do you ensure kids are ready for education? There are concerns that some kids and some families feel like classroom education, no longer important. How do you address those things? So these discussions will continue as session approaches us.
Yeah, and I guess a comment on that is it's not unlike other issues that there's going to be a period of education by the legislators, educating themselves on the issue before they even consider whether or not there's something that could be done legislatively. Right. There are some programs nationally that are having an impact on attendance, and it's definitely something that that needs to be addressed. Okay, do you expect any proposals for science of reading, curriculum adoption, or teacher training?
On the latter, teacher training, if there'll be any programs, we definitely anticipate there being conversations on teacher training. I think there'll be something in the same regard as teacher retention, right? Figuring out what can be done differently in the state of Florida, and probably even better, but definitely different in the state of Florida, to make sure that we are retaining teachers, and training more likely will come up in that conversation. So we definitely should anticipate that. As far as curriculum, over the last several sessions, there's been a lot of conversations about about books and what's required, what's not required. On curriculum itself, I don't have anything yet on that one. Of course, I will keep you all updated on that as we roll into session. I would not be surprised if curriculum does come up, and that would have been a great question for Senator Kalatu, but we could find out more about that in that regard. To this point, through our committee weeks, there's really been no discussions on curriculum as we've heard in years past, and they could keep that same pattern. I do believe there'll be some conversation whether there's legislation. I wouldn't anticipate that. I do know that, as we all remember, last year we had HB1, which was aforementioned. There's going to be some level of a bill. I would not deem it HB1 2.0, but some level of a bill dealing with progress and process, things that, as a result of that bill, that needs to be addressed. Maybe more of a, what I was saying, maybe glitch, but not glitch as we may see it defined. So we'll see something in that regard. Not sure if curriculum will be involved in that or not. Let's also remember it's an election year after this, and so members may not want to tackle anything of major this upcoming session. But I would definitely keep you all abreast as we hear more on that if anything is brought up. Great question.
And anything specific on the science of reading? I haven't heard of anything on that, but
I have not
you?
either. No, sir.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I know there's some promising programs again, but at the district level.
Right.
I don't know of anything statewide. Anything that you're hearing specific to higher education and the Florida college system that's being proposed?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. We are several things. First of all, as you're hearing a lot with dealing with the handling of protests, right? With especially with Israel and Hamas, there's intensity there. Representative Randy Fine has been very vocal about how our state university systems are handling protests and things of that nature on their campus in regards to these matters. We definitely should expect that to intensify even the more. There are some bills that have been filed thus far that will impact. I'm actually pulling those up now. That would impact students, their fee status or their in-state or out-of-state tuition status in that regard. Funding is always going to be of utmost importance, right? Performance funding for our state university systems. And so we definitely should anticipate more in that regard. As it relates to policy itself, there have been bills that have been filed, but as far as from the committees themselves, we haven't seen anything yet that rolling out in that regard. I will also share that the governor has yet to really roll out any of his priority policy ideals. And so usually that becomes the starting block for what comes thereafter. And the governor has yet to do that. So really hadn't gotten much of a signal from his administration, other than, of course, talking to the university presidents and the board of governors as it relates to how they handle on-campus protests and things of that nature. But as far as substantive policy legislation, we haven't seen anything yet. And so until the governor rolls out recommendations, it's going to be hard to really determine what they're going to end up doing. They're going to want some level of interest or I don't want to say direction, but interest from the executive branch to know if there's any appetite there.
Because there's been a lot of interest in the executive branch in higher ed lately, hasn't there? So a twofold, this sounds like a civics question, so we'll test you here, Darrick. Twofold question, what is the number of bills that a senator and representative may sponsor, and what's the last day that they can sponsor or file a bill?
I can answer both of those. Thank you for that question. So Florida has a bicameral legislature, as we know. We have a House and a Senate. In the House, it used to be 6 bills per member. On the representatives, on the former Speaker Chris Sprowls, now on the Speaker Renner, they increased it to 7 bills. So every representative, House member can actually do a total of 7 bills filed under their name. They can, of course, they can co-sponsor any other bill. It does not affect their bill number, but as far as them being chief sponsor, they can do 6. In the Senate, however, it's unlimited because there's only 40 senators. There is no cap on how many bills they can file. In the House, again, it's 7 because they have 120 legislators in that regard. Our session begins January 9th, ends March 8th. So you asked the question of when last time they can file a bill. Bill drafting, all bills had to be in bill drafting on November the 14th, which is already passed. Every bill that's in bill drafting currently has to be out of bill drafting with a sponsor, both House and Senate, right, with a sponsor's name on that bill by 12 noon the first day of session. So by 12 noon on Tuesday, January 9th, any bill draft that's in bill drafting have to come out with a member name on it and an actual Senate bill or House bill number to be available for consideration during session. Now, you will always see during session that they do committee bills, right? Committee bills do not have a deadline that can roll out at any point during session for the most part, right? But as far as an individual member sponsored bill, has to be out of bill drafting with that member's name on it and a bill number given by 12 noon on January 9th.
And then speak a little bit to amendments. I'm just projecting here, if this person's saying, oh, I've got a great idea, I want to get to my legislator, maybe it's past time for them to initiate a bill, but what about amendment?
Yeah, so amendments is a whole lot different, right? You want to find a bill that's actually moving, right? Meaning is being heard in the committee, because you can't amend a bill that hasn't been heard or not in a position of being heard. So you want to identify, if you have an idea for an amendment. You want to identify a bill, as we call it, a vehicle, but a bill that's in movement, that your idea is germane, right? Is relevant to that bill, whether by way of subject or by way of that Florida statute being opened up. And in that regard, you really have until really the most part of all of session. You really encourage to get it in much earlier. So most bills get 3 committee references upon being filed. You want to try to get that language amended on through one of those committee references. And the reason why is you want to make sure that that language is allowed to have committee conversation. If not, what will happen is a member could raise a point of order, right? And then by raising a point of order, they can have that language that you're trying to have amended stopped and even ultimately killed if there's concerns about it. But also sometimes you can have an amendment filed that takes a bill from having no fiscal note at all of a sudden it has a fiscal note because that amendment is trying to do something that has appropriations attached to it. So the first order of business is whatever your idea is, you want to talk to your local legislator and make him or her aware of what it is and the why behind what you are proposing. Along with doing that, they may ask you, do you have a bill in mind? You want to try to identify again a bill that your idea is relevant to, right? Because you want to be able to attach it to something that's going to require additional conversations with whomever the sponsor is in that regard. And so whatever that idea is, I definitely tell you to flesh it out. I would meet locally with my legislators and make them aware of it, and even try to garner some support in that regard. And usually they will know if you're going to be able to even make any movement in Tallahassee on what you have in mind.
Right. And you sort of slid in there to the fiscal impact, which is huge.
Yeah. So it's a very, a lot of bills have great ideas, but the fiscal note is so large where that bill never gets a hearing whatsoever, because again, they don't want to tie up too much state appropriations on one piece of legislation. So that's important.
Next question, have there been any conversations around concerns about HB 109 and Senate Bill 246 regarding the municipalities petitioning to convert district schools to charter schools?
Ooh. Yeah, so this bill here, this is Representative Andrade and Senator Harrell. Both of these bills, as I mentioned, have 3 committee references, which is usually the norm. Most bills get 3 references, which is kind of, again, normal. If you get 2, it kind of speaks to the importance of that bill. If you get 4 committee references, it kind of speaks to the lack of appetite for that bill. As we're talking today, neither bill has been heard in their respective chamber. I haven't heard much conversation about the legislation to date. Just so you know, the House bill was originally filed back in October of last year, right? The Senate bill was filed back in November of last year. And so we've had several committee weeks since both these bills were filed with no committee action taking place as of now. Again, we have a lot of time left, right? Because session is 9 weeks. Right, we have a lot of time left to see if any movement in that regard. It's been minimal to, actually, I would say that I've heard nothing about either bill in that regard. And so this will be one of the bills we'll keep monitoring to make sure we can provide updates on this one.
Good. For the governor's budget recommendation, could you define, quote, other instructional personnel?
Yeah, so other instructional personnel is usually, they're looking at substitute teachers, they're looking at librarians, they're looking at like media center employees, not your in-classroom teachers based on that definition, but it's others who have some level of interaction with the student. Again, a librarian is a really good example of what they would deem other instructional personnel.
So I wish we could have done this while the senator was there, but if you look at the expanded agenda for the Education Pre-K-12 committee, it was a hearing on Senate Bill 7000, one of the 3. I'm sorry, I may not get the right one, so I'm not going to try. But it's Commissioner Diaz's response and itemized recommendations for specific bill provisions for deregulation. Are you familiar with that, or what the process will be on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out which one that one is. That may be,
I'm actually looking at it. It was the
I wonder if it's,
the meeting date was November 7th.
okay.
But
What
are
was
you
the
familiar
question?
with what are you familiar with what the Department of Education's role will be in developing the deregulation recommendations?
Oh, good, good. That's a great question. Yeah, so a lot of what will take place in these bills, again, ultimately they go back to the department as we talked about, right? And so implementation, there would have to be some, the department will get involved, the state board will be reconvened for their conversation and approval. And one can safely assume that as that there's been discussions had between the Senate president, the Senate, and interested parties. The department, right, who ultimately would be tasked with all three of these bills and implementing these bills. The way that's going to look is one of two things we got to figure out. Number one is will all three bills remain separate bills, or will they be merged together as one bill? That's the first thing we don't know yet. But that's something worth taking into consideration. Regardless of how that's done, upon the governor acting on a bill or bills that get to him, right, there'll need to be some time given to the department to be able to prioritize how this is done. We should anticipate the department, at least my opinion is the department will definitely weigh in on the legislation, especially if the implementation of the bills is not realistic. Let's recall the department also got tasked with HB1 from this current year, and that by itself has a lot that's required of them to do. And so we don't know yet how long that runway will be given. There definitely will be some consideration and respect given to the department. I'll use that word to make sure they have enough time to do that. The state board, of course, will have to definitely be involved in that regard. And you know, they can do it where they end up having more public conversations for the public to be able to view in that regard. But ultimately, the department is going to have to make sure that they go through the 1000 series and work through these deregulation ideas. And I'll just mention this for everyone that's listening. We're far away from the finish line. Right, what we see now in 7,000, 7,002, and 7,004 more likely will not be the final products because again, you have another chamber that has to be involved, the governor has to be involved, and outside parties. And so, what we see today, we probably will not see come March 9th or March 8th. I'm sorry.
Do you have any recommendations? So, if someone listening now, someone say works in philanthropy, wants to make the voice heard on this, what process should they use? Is there any way they can influence this at this point?
So yes, so I'm a believer still that all things are local, right? I strongly implore that you are conversing with, at least reaching out and communicating to your legislators, even if they're not on an education committee per se. They're going to have a chance to act on these bills because these bills will end up on their respective floor. So you want to, whether that's through a text if you know them personally, whether that's through an email, whether that's you going to their local office, you want to try to get on record and make known to them either there's concerns you see, if you support it, if you have questions. Because I've seen a lot of members, they will bring that information to a committee meeting or to the sponsor of the legislation, right? So never think that your voice will not be heard. A lot of the legislators will make sure, hey, I got a question from back in my district on this. Can you help give clarity on what the intent is? And so it's very important to know who your legislators are. Again, if they're on the education committee, that's absolutely great. If they're not, don't let that discourage you. You just want to make sure that you are on record. And then also, if you're able to get to Tallahassee, they do allow for public testimony in these committee hearings. They usually assess you 3 minutes to be able to speak in that regard. And so you have that option as well. But if you're not able to get here, make usage again of meeting with your local legislators, make usage of emailing the bill sponsors or the committee staff. They're usually very responsive when you reach out and you ask questions, especially if you're trying to get a better understanding and clarity as to what's going on. They're usually very, very helpful in that regard. These bills are large, right? And so in that regard, it's really hard sometimes to digest it. Let me also give you a good pointer. Senate Bill 7,000, 7,002, 7,004 also have staff analysis that's been done by the committee staff that really is like a cheat sheet where it kind of walks you through what's in the bill, but also in a much reader-friendly way than how the bill is drafted. I encourage you to read the staff analysis. It gives you really a great insight. Also gives you historical perspective. And then usually will speak to if there's a fiscal note attached to the bill, what that number looks like. And then it also kind of gives you the next steps that takes place. And if any of these bills make a change in the next committee, the analysis is updated, and the update actually speaks to the changes that were made in the previous committee. And so you definitely want to educate yourself with what's in there.
And set up to track those bills if you want. Okay, last question. This will have to be like a 30-second answer. In the governor's budget and priorities, it's reported there's $200 million that's going to be used for salary increases for teachers. How will those increases be allocated?
Great question. I think it's going to be allocated the same way it's been thus far with the previous ones. And so I don't think they're going to make any changes in that regard. Of course, the department will play a major role in that. But I don't think we'll see any difference from how we've been seeing the implementation of those salaries. Yeah,
and another note, this is the governor's budget. It's, the House and Senate need to do their own. And it doesn't speak directly to implementation or how that's done. Chris, can you bring up the last couple of slides? Darrick, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. And to everybody here, you are invited to a reception that the consortium's having in Tallahassee. The details are in the PDF of your handouts, as well as how to RSVP. It's through email, and the email is on this invitation. Next slide. As I mentioned, we're going to be sending out an email with a link to the recording. We're going to include the PDFs. We may include links to a couple of those bills that we spent so much time talking about. In addition to that, it's on the consortium's website, right where that arrow goes. Next slide. And if you think of anything after the fact, you have my email, you have Mary's email. Feel free to reach out to either of us. Otherwise, we thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you for some great questions. Thanks to Darrick, and thanks to Ashley and Mary for co-hosting this. And with that, please have a great rest of your day.